The question was designed to establish a ceiling. That is the honest description of what Cadet Zeth was doing when he asked the only human at the table to provide his confirmed kill count for comparative baseline purposes. The classroom had 12 cadets in it. Most of them were smiling when he asked. It was the kind of question that gets asked in institutions with hierarchies when someone new arrives and the hierarchy needs to know where to place them. Marcus Venn looked at Zeth with gray eyes that didn't change expression based on what the room was doing, and he said, "Do you want the frontier service number, or the total?" The smiling stopped before he finished the sentence. What came next wasn't a conversation. It was 70 minutes of documentary footage that nobody in that room had been ready for. The Interstellar Defense Academy on orbital platform Kession had been producing officers for 190 years. Its halls were carved from the same dark alloy as the warships its graduates commanded. Its walls held the graduating portraits of 1,100 officers across 40 species, arranged in chronological order so that every cadet who walked those corridors could see the weight of tradition pressing in from both sides. The graduation rate was 58%. The washout rate was calculated and published annually as a point of institutional pride. If you were here, the building seemed to say, you had already survived something most people couldn't. The Academy did not award placement on the basis of species. It awarded placement on the basis of performance. This was officially the policy. What the policy did not account for, what no official policy ever quite accounts for, was the weight of 190 years of history, pressing down on the question of which species the program had been designed for, and which had arrived as a recent addition to the invitation list. Humans had been part of the Interstellar Coalition for 27 years. Human cadets had been attending Keshen for 12. In 12 years, 9 humans had graduated. The current class had one. His name was Marcus Venn. He was 23 years old, came from a border colony on the outermost edge of mapped space, and had arrived at the Academy 6 weeks ago with a service file that his enrollment officer had forwarded to 3 different departments for verification before approving his admission. Because the numbers in it did not look like the numbers of a 23-year-old, the verification had come back confirmed each time. Marcus had not mentioned this. He found his quarters, attended his classes, and carried himself with the specific focus of someone who was here to learn and was not particularly interested in anything that wasn't the work. The work, however, was not the only thing waiting for him at Keshe. There was an informal tradition at the Academy that no one had ever written down, because the things that exist in institutional culture are often most powerful precisely because they are never written down. The tradition worked like this. When a cadet arrived who was unusual from an unusual species, with an unusual background, carrying an unusual set of credentials, the other cadets would find a way, in the early weeks, to locate the ceiling of what that cadet could actually do, to establish, through the civilized mechanism of classroom discussion or training evaluation, where exactly this person belonged in the hierarchy of competence that every military institution produces, whether it intends to or not. It wasn't cruelty. At least, it didn't consider itself cruelty. It was the social architecture of a place that needed to know who it could trust with a ship and who it couldn't. The problem was that the tradition had been built by the species who had always been at the top of the hierarchy to evaluate the species they had not yet fully decided about. And like all traditions built that way, it had a specific blind spot. It could not account for someone who arrived with a ceiling it hadn't seen before. The moment came in the 5th week, in Instructor Tharen Applied Doctrine Seminar. 12 cadets around a hexagonal table. The topic of the day was tactical resource allocation under conditions of systemic disadvantage. How do you win when you have less of everything? It was, as it turned out, precisely the wrong topic to use as cover for the tradition. The cadet who launched it was named Zeth. He was Rel'kari, one of the oldest spacefaring species in the coalition, sharp-featured, quick-minded, and carrying the specific confidence of someone whose people had been writing military doctrine for 3 centuries before humanity had discovered radio. He was ranked 2nd in the class, and he had the political intelligence to phrase what he said in the language of academic inquiry. For the purpose of this discussion, Zeth said, addressing the table with the performed openness of someone who had prepared this carefully, it might be useful to establish comparative baselines. Combat effectiveness metrics differ significantly between species, as we know. For context, a pause that was exactly as long as it needed to be. What would a typical human soldier's confirmed engagement record look like at, say, 5 years of active frontier service? Several cadets at the table shifted slightly, not uncomfortably. The shift of people who recognized what was happening and had decided which side they were on. Instructor Tharen at the head of the table said nothing. He had been waiting for this since the 2nd week, when he had finished reading Marcus Venn's file and understood that this seminar was eventually going to become the most important class session of the year. Marcus looked at Zeth with the steady gray eyes that Tharen had noted over 5 weeks never changed expression. In response to what the room was doing, only in response to what Marcus was thinking. "That's a useful question," Marcus said, and his tone made clear he meant it. "Are you asking about standard frontier deployment or extended contact service?" Zeth, who had expected hesitation, or deflection, or possibly defensiveness, recalibrated quickly. "Extended contact," he said. "For a thorough baseline." "Which metric?" Marcus said. Confirmed eliminations, operational outcomes, or survival rate in asymmetric contact. A small silence. A different kind of silence than the one Sarek had been expecting to produce. Start with eliminations, Sarek said. Marcus said a number. The silence that followed was not the one Sarek had planned for either. The number moved through the room the way certain kinds of information move, not loudly, but changing the temperature of everything it touched. Several cadets did the arithmetic quickly, checking the number against what they knew about frontier service timelines, standard engagement density, and the physiological capabilities of a human soldier. Their faces went through a sequence that Vardeth had been expecting. Initial doubt, recalculation, residual doubt, and then the specific expression of someone whose recalculation keeps producing the same result and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. That number, Sarek said, in a tone that was no longer quite as composed as it had been, is not consistent with "it's in my service file," Marcus said, not defensively. The engagements are documented and most of them have field recording. If the number seems inconsistent, the documentation will clarify it. Vardeth spoke for the first time since the session began. The relevant documentation, he said, is available through the Academy's operational archive. He paused. I've already prepared the files. He pressed the display control. The seminar room wall opened into a screen, and what it showed was not a training simulation. It was not a prepared presentation. It was raw field footage from 5 years of frontier service, the specific grain and compression artifacts of recording systems designed for durability rather than production quality, the kind of visual record whose roughness is precisely what makes it carry weight. What Vardeth had done, over the 2 weeks since he read Marcus's file, was organize those 5 years into a structured case study sequence, not because he needed to dramatize anything. The material did not require dramatization, but because he recognized that what he had in front of him was one of those rare opportunities where the course material and the most important lesson of the year happened to be the same thing. The first engagement was a supply convoy ambush on the Kelva transit route. 14 human soldiers against an estimated force 4 times their number, with no communication capability and no extraction window. Marcus had been a sergeant at the time, 20 years old, 3 years into frontier service. The footage showed the actual terrain, the actual conditions, and the specific series of decisions made in real time under actual pressure by an actual person. There was nothing cinematic about it. That was the point. By the third case study, the room had changed. The particular quality of attention had shifted from the skeptical evaluation that everyone had brought in to something quieter and more complete. Sarek, who had come to this seminar planning to establish a ceiling, was watching footage of someone else's floor. The worst conditions, the hardest situations, the moments where the math of survival said no, and watching the decisions that had been made in those moments with the focus of someone who had realized he was looking at a graduate seminar in asymmetric doctrine that happened to be wearing a baseline discussion as a disguise. By the 5th case study, no one at the table was performing anything. They were just watching. The 7th engagement was the one Vardeth had pulled specifically because it illustrated something the textbook on asymmetric engagement described in theory but almost never showed in practice. The specific cognitive process of improvising tactical doctrine in real time when the situation has moved outside every prepared response. It was 17 minutes of footage from a communications relay station on a colony called Mir, and by the time it ended, 2 of the cadets at the table had forgotten to take notes entirely and were simply watching with a focused stillness of people encountering something they hadn't expected to encounter in a seminar room. Sarek was one of them. When the final segment ended and Vardeth switched off the display, the room held its silence for several seconds before anyone moved. Asymmetric doctrine, Vardeth said to the table, is most productively studied through practice rather than theory, because the theoretical framing tends to flatten the specific quality that makes it work. He looked at the class. The question Cadet Sarek raised about comparative species capability is a legitimate analytical question. The answer, as we have now seen applied across 7 case studies, is somewhat more complicated than the question assumed. He closed the display panel. The doctrine works because the practitioner is operating inside a set of constraints that the opposition has not fully modeled. The asymmetry is not only in numbers, it is an expectation. He picked up his notes. I would like everyone to write a 1200-word analysis of Engagement 7 by next session, specifically addressing the decision sequence in the final 8 minutes. We will discuss how the principles we observe there apply to the fleet scenarios in the 2nd unit. He dismissed the class. The cadets filtered out slowly, with the specific movement of people who have a lot to think about and are doing most of it internally. Several passed Marcus's position at the table and said nothing, but their body language was specific. The body language of people whose assessment had been updated, and who hadn't yet decided where the new assessment settled. Sarek was the last to reach the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and stood there for a moment in the particular stillness of someone finishing a calculation they had started 90 minutes ago and had not expected to produce this result. The number you gave, he said. He wasn't looking at Marcus, but he was speaking to him. That was the frontier service total. Yes, Marcus said. What's the total? Marcus told him. The difference between the two numbers was not small. Zeth stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, not with the tone he had brought into the room at the beginning of the session, but with something underneath it that was more honest. How many of those were asymmetric engagements? All of them, Marcus said. I've never been on the larger side. Zeth left. Vardeth remained at the head of the table, making notes in the class assessment file. Marcus gathered his materials, his tablet, his supplementary reading, the small tactical diagram he had been sketching during the footage that was not doodling but was, on inspection, a force positioning overlay for Engagement 7, drawn from memory. You had those files ready since before the session, Marcus said. It was not a question. Since the 4th week, Vardeth said. I was waiting for the right entry point. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Something moved in the gray eyes, not pride, not satisfaction, but the quieter thing that lives underneath both of those. Asymmetric doctrine, he said. The interesting part is never the engagement itself. What's the interesting part? Vardeth asked. Because he was a good instructor, and the best instructors ask questions they already know the answer to when the answer needs to be said by a specific person. The expectation gap, Marcus said. The space between what the opposition thinks you can do and what you actually can do. That's where the engagement is really won. Usually before a single shot is fired. He picked up his materials and walked out. Vardeth sat at the empty table for a moment. The seminar room still had that particular quality of air that rooms keep after something has shifted in them. He opened the class performance file and found Marcus's assessment entry. He thought about what to write for a long time. Then he wrote 3 words. Already teaching it. Word travels in military academies the way it travels in all closed institutions, fast, specific, and through channels that are not the official ones. By the next morning, every 4th-year cadet on platform Kessian had either watched the footage Vardeth had pulled or had heard the details from someone who had. The specific number Marcus had said in the seminar had become a kind of fact that circulates in dining halls and training corridors as people do, and redo the math and keep getting the same answer. The Academy's tactical training coordinator, Commander Rel'kari, with 30 years of commissioned service and the flat, evaluating gaze of someone who had seen every variety of cadet that 190 years of institutional history could produce, pulled Marcus's file on the 3rd day after the seminar. She read it the way Vardeth had read it twice, because the first time produced results that seemed inconsistent with the listed age. Then she did something that was unusual for an officer of her rank in the middle of a training cycle. She scheduled a direct assessment session with a single 2nd-year cadet, one-on-one, no observers, in the practical training suite on level 4. She didn't tell Marcus why. He arrived at the scheduled time, in standard training clothes, without the particular tension that most cadets carried into any direct evaluation with a senior officer. Ress noted this. She had prepared 6 tactical scenarios. Progressive difficulty, the kind of scenarios designed for 3rd and 4th-year evaluation, each one containing a specific decision point where standard academy doctrine produced a suboptimal outcome and the correct move required thinking outside the doctrine framework that cadets had been trained in. She gave Marcus the first one. He solved it in the way the 4th-years solved it, correctly, efficiently, with the specific signature of someone who had learned the doctrine well and was applying it cleanly. She gave him the second one. He solved it faster, and the solution was slightly different from the textbook approach, a variation that Ress recognized, after a moment, as more efficient than the method Kessian taught. Not because it contradicted the doctrine, but because it refined it in a way that accounted for a variable the standard version didn't. She made a note. She gave him the third one. The third scenario was one she had designed herself specifically for this session, after reading his file. It was a situation with no clean solution, a resource allocation problem where every available option had a significant cost. And the goal was not to find a perfect answer but to find the least bad one and be able to articulate exactly why it was least bad. Marcus looked at the scenario for a long moment. The frame of this problem, he said, assumes that the objective is fixed. Ress said nothing. This was the correct response for an instructor in this situation. If the objective is fixed, then you're right. There's no good answer. But frontier engagements almost never have fixed objectives in the way that tactical doctrine assumes. He looked at the scenario layout. If I change the objective to something achievable with the available resources, the problem becomes what to do after that, which is a different problem, and one with a solution. The objective was specified, Ress said. The specified objective wasn't achievable, Marcus said. In my experience, when the specified objective isn't achievable, the choice is whether you want a situation where you've failed to achieve the objective or a situation where you've achieved something and have a platform to continue from. He looked at her directly. I'd rather have the platform. Ress wrote something in her assessment that she didn't share until 3 days later, when she forwarded it to the Academy Commandant with a recommendation that had no precedent in the institution's 190 years of operation. She recommended that Marcus Venn be invited to co-teach the second unit of Applied Doctrine, not as a special case, as the most qualified person available. The Academy's response to Ress's recommendation took 11 days, because it required 3 levels of administrative review to determine whether the relevant policy permitted a second-year cadet to hold a co-teaching role in an upper division course. The answer, after 11 days, was that the policy did not specifically prohibit it, which is the specific kind of administrative answer that means yes. Marcus was informed by Vardeth, who had been the one to forward the idea to Ress in the first place after writing those 3 words in the assessment file. He gave Marcus the news in the same seminar room where the session had taken place. Co-teaching, Marcus said with you. The unit begins in 4 weeks, Vardeth said. I'd like your input on the scenario design for sessions 3 through 6, specifically the asymmetric contact cases. You want frontier material. I want accurate material, Vardeth said. The scenarios we currently use are theoretically correct. They're calibrated to what doctrine assumes the situations will look like. Your files suggest the situations don't always look like that. They almost never do, Marcus said. Then the cadets should know that before they find out the hard way. Vardeth looked at him. That's what the course is for. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the blank seminar table where 5 weeks ago he had sat and given a number that had changed the temperature of the room. Sarek came to me yesterday, he said. Vardeth waited. He asked if he could review the full operational archive from Merith, not for any assignment, just to understand the decision sequence better. Marcus paused. I told him yes. We went through it together for about 2 hours. Vardeth said nothing because there was nothing to say that would improve the statement. Asymmetric doctrine, Marcus said, for the second time in 5 weeks in this room, is most interesting to me because it's not really about the engagement. It's about the gap, Vardeth said. It's about the gap, Marcus confirmed. The space between what's expected and what's real. The engagement just lives in that space. If you close the gap before the engagement starts, you've usually already won. He picked up his tablet. I'll have scenario drafts for sessions 3 through 6 by the end of next week. He walked out. Vardeth sat at the table and listened to the specific quiet of the room after Marcus left it, which was different. He had noticed, from the quiet of most rooms after most people left them, it had a quality of having been used in the fullest sense of the word. He opened his instructor's log and added a note to the session record. Cadet Ven has been at this institution for 5 weeks. In that time, he has amended 1 instructor's course design, shifted 1 fourth-year ranking cadet's understanding of doctrine application, prompted a tactical review session that neither of them was required to attend, and been recommended for co-teaching by the most experienced tactical trainer in the building. It is also, apparently, a biographical one. He closed the log and began preparing for next week's session. 3 months later, in the Academy Commandant's office on level 14, 2 documents arrived in the same encrypted packet from Coalition Military Intelligence. The first was a standard performance review. Marcus Ven, second-year cadet, applied doctrine, instructor firearms and close combat scores in the top 2% of all current cadets. Tactical assessment results that the testing coordinator had flagged for manual review because the AI scoring system kept producing results outside its expected range. It was a classified intelligence summary, routed from a frontier monitoring post in the outer sectors, marked with the specific clearance level that meant the commandant would be the only person at Keshen to see it. It had been forwarded with a short annotation from the Intelligence Division, relevant to current enrollment. The summary described a series of engagements over a 4-year period in the outer frontier, the same engagements documented in Marcus Ven's service file, the engagements that had been verified before his admission, the engagements that had been shown in a seminar room 6 weeks ago and changed the way 12 cadets thought about asymmetric doctrine. What the service file did not contain, and what this document did, was the strategic context that frontier field reports didn't include because field reports recorded outcomes, not the larger picture that outcomes fit into. The outer frontier, the document explained, had not been in the state of random insurgent conflict that most coalition records classified it as during those 4 years. It had been a coordinated suppression campaign run by a species called the Vreth, not formally acknowledged, not officially documented, conducted through proxies and deniable actors, aimed at making the coalition's outer settlements ungovernable, without ever triggering the formal response threshold that would require the coalition to act. The campaign had been, by the Intelligence Division's assessment, almost entirely successful, except in one sector of outer frontier which happened to include the settlement Marcus Ven had grown up in, had maintained function, governance, and defensibility throughout the entire 4-year campaign. The intelligence analysts had spent 8 months trying to understand why. Their conclusion, documented in a section of the summary that the commandant read 3 times, was that the Vreth campaign's proxy actors had encountered something they had not modeled in their planning. A frontier soldier who was conducting his own asymmetric operation against theirs, systematically at the individual level, using the same principles in reverse, who had identified the coordination pattern in what the official reports classified as random incursions, who had disrupted that pattern, engagement by engagement, over 4 years, without ever having access to the intelligence data that would have confirmed what he was clearly already certain of. The Intelligence Division's summary ended with a recommendation. It said, It is our assessment that Cadet Ven entered the academy not to learn asymmetric doctrine, but to formalize the understanding he had already developed independently under field conditions. His presence in an institutional military education context represents an opportunity to transmit practical doctrine evolution that the academy's current curriculum has not yet incorporated. We recommend that his co-teaching role be expanded rather than concluded at the end of the current unit. We also recommend a review of our frontier engagement records, with Cadet Ven as a consultant, to determine what else we may have classified incorrectly. The Commandant set the document down. She looked at the wall of her office, which held 40 years of portraits of graduates who had come through Keshen and gone on to shape the Coalition's military history. She thought about a 23-year-old from the outer frontier who had arrived with a file that produced incorrect-looking numbers that kept verifying as correct, who had sat in a seminar and answered a question honestly and taught a lesson nobody had been expecting to receive, who had walked out of every room he'd been in so far leaving it permanently different from how he'd found it. She thought about the doctrine concept that Vardeth had told her Marcus kept returning to, the gap between what's expected and what's real. She had been commandant of this institution for 12 years. She had processed the files of thousands of cadets. She had seen genuine talent many times. She had seen the rare quality that could not be taught, only recognized, and then given room perhaps a dozen times. She had never, in 12 years, seen a cadet who was using the academy the way Marcus Ven was using it. Not as a place to be trained, that as a platform to continue from. She opened her communication terminal and began composing a response to the intelligence division, and she thought, as she typed, about the gap, about how long it had existed, in this institution and across the Coalition's outer frontier, between what everyone had expected a young human soldier from a border settlement to be and what he actually was. The gap had been there for 5 years. He had been living in it, working in it, building in it, the entire time. And the galaxy had only just noticed. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the most dangerous thing in any room is sometimes the person everyone assumed had the lowest ceiling, subscribe. There are more human stories from the stars. And in every one of them, the gap was there long before anyone thought to look.